The 3 volumes of the Gulag Archipelago, one continuous extended scream of outrage, are, paradoxically, brilliant, bitter, disbelieving, and infused with awe. Awe at the strength characterizing the best among us in the worst of all situations. In that monumental text, published in 1973, Alexander Solzhenitsyn conducted an experiment in literary investigation, a hybrid of journalism, history, and biography, unlike anything ever written before or since. In 1985, the author bestowed his approval upon Edward E. Erickson Jr.'s single-volume abridgment, republished here on the 50th anniversary of the completion of the full 3-volume edition and centenary of the author's birth, and sold some 30 million copies in 35 languages. Between the pages of Solzhenitsyn's book, apart from the documentation of the horrors of the legions of the dead, counted and uncounted, and the masses whose lives were torn asunder, are the innumerable soul-chilling personal stories carefully preserved, making the tragedy of mass betrayal, torture, and death not the mere statistic Stalin so disdainfully described, but individual, real, and terrible. It is a matter of pure historical fact that the Gulag Archipelago played a primary role in bringing the Soviet Empire to its knees. Although economically unsustainable, ruled in the most corrupt manner imaginable, and reliant on the slavery and enforced deceit of its citizens, the Soviet system managed to stumble forward through far too many decades before being cut to the quick. The courageous leaders of the labor unions in Poland, the great Pope John Paul II, and the American President Ronald Reagan, with his blunt insistence that the West faced an evil empire, all played their role in its defeat and collapse. It was Solzhenitsyn, however, whose revelations made it positively shameful to defend not just the Soviet state, but the very system of thought that made that state what it was. It was Solzhenitsyn who most crucially made the case that the terrible excesses of communism could not be conveniently blamed on the corruption of the Soviet leadership, the cult of personality surrounding Stalin, or the failure to put the otherwise stellar and admirable utopian principles of Marxism into proper practice. It was Solzhenitsyn who demonstrated that the death of millions and the devastation of many more were instead a direct causal consequence of the philosophy, worse, perhaps, the theology, driving the communist system. The hypothetically egalitarian universalist doctrines of Karl Marx contained hidden within them sufficient hatred, resentment, envy, and denial of individual culpability and responsibility to produce nothing but poison and death when manifested in the world. For Marx, man was a member of a class, an economic class, a group, that and little more, and history nothing but the battleground of classes and groups. His admirers continue to regard, Marx's doctrine as one of compassion, moral by definition, virtuous by fiat. Consider the working classes in all their oppression and work forthrightly to free them. But hate may well be a stronger and more compelling motivator than love. In consequence, it took no time in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution for solidarity with the common man and the apparently laudable demand for universal equality to manifest its unarticulated and ever-darkening shadow. First came the most brutal indictment of the class enemy. Then came the ever-expanding definition of that enemy until every single person in the entirety of the state found him or herself at risk of encapsulation within that insatiable and devouring net. The verdict, delivered to those deemed at fault by those who elevated themselves to the simultaneously held positions of judge, jury, and executioner? The necessity to eradicate the victimizers, the oppressors, in toto, without any consideration whatsoever for reactionary niceties such as individual innocence. Let us note as well, this outcome wasn't the result of the initially pristine Marxist doctrine becoming corrupt over time, but something apparent and present at the very beginning of the Soviet state itself. Solzhenitsyn cites, for example, one Martin Latsis, writing for the newspaper Red Terror, November 1st, 1918. "We are not fighting against single individuals. We are exterminating the bourgeoisie as a class. It is not necessary during the interrogation to look for evidence proving that the accused opposed the Soviets by word or action. The first question you should ask him is, what class does he belong to? What is his origin, his education, and his profession? These are the questions that will determine the fate of the accused." Such is the sense and essence of Red Terror. It is necessary to think when you read such a thing, to meditate long and hard on the message. It is necessary to recognize, for example, that the writer believed that it would be better to execute 10,000 potentially innocent individuals than to allow one poisonous member of the oppressor class to remain free. It is equally necessary to pose the question: who precisely belonged to that hypothetical entity, the bourgeoisie? It is not as if the boundaries of such a category are self-evident, there for the mere perceiving. They must be drawn. But where, exactly? And more importantly, by whom or by what? If it's hate inscribing the lines instead of love, they will inevitably be drawn so that the lowest, meanest, most cruel and useless of the conceptual geographers will be justified in manifesting the greatest possible evil and producing the greatest possible misery. Members of the bourgeoisie? Beyond all redemption, they had to go as a matter of course. What of their wives? Children? Even their grandchildren? Off with their heads too. All were incorrigibly corrupted by their class identity, and their destruction therefore ethically necessitated. How convenient that the darkest and direst of all possible motivations could be granted the highest of moral standings. That was a true marriage of hell and of heaven. What values, what philosophical presumptions truly dominated under such circumstances? Was it desire for brotherhood, dignity, and freedom from want? Not in the least. Not given the outcome. It was instead and obviously the murderous rage of hundreds of thousands of biblical Cains, each looking to torture, destroy, and sacrifice their own private Abels. There is simply no other manner of accounting for the corpses. What can be concluded in the deepest, most permanent sense from Solzhenitsyn's anguished Gulag narrative? First, we learn what is indisputable, what we all should have learned by now, what we have nonetheless failed to learn, that the left, like the right, can go too far, that the left has in the past gone much too far. Second, we learn what is far more subtle and difficult, how and why that going too far occurs. We learn, as Solzhenitsyn so profoundly insists, that the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. And we learn as well that we all are, each of us, simultaneously oppressor and oppressed. Thus, we come to realize that the twin categories of guilty oppressor and justice-seeking victim can be made endlessly inclusive. This is not least because we all benefit unfairly and are all equally victimized by our thrownness, our arbitrary placement in the flow of time. We all accrue undeserved and somewhat random privilege from the vagaries of our place of birth, our inequitably distributed talents, our ethnicity, race, culture, and sex. We all belong to a group, some group, that has been elevated in comparative status through no effort of our own. This is true in some manner, along some dimension of group category, for every solitary individual, except for the single most lowly of all. At some time and in some manner we may all in consequence be justly targeted as oppressors, and may all equally seek justice or revenge as victims. Even if the initiators of the revolution had, therefore, in their most pure moments, been driven by a holy desire to lift up the downtrodden, was it not guaranteed that they would be overtaken by those motivated primarily by envy, hate, and the desire to destroy as the revolution progressed? Hence the establishment of the hungrily growing and most often fatal list of class enemies right from the very first moments of the communist revolution.